Welcome everyone to today's Paren webinar, State of the Industry Report, US EV Fast Charging Q2 2025. I am your co-host, Loren McDonald, and we at Paren are really excited about today's webinar. We've had an overwhelming number of registrants. This is our third Paren webinar, and so maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration to talk about this was a record number of registrations for us, but we know that there's a lot of interest in this, and especially because we've got I think really a lot of exciting and positive news to share, as well as maybe some concerns. But for those of you who have attended webinars in the past with us, you know that we love to start off with a little trivia rather than doing that sort of silence for 60 seconds or whatever as people join up the webinar. We're already seeing we're up to over 80 people, so we'll kick it off here in a minute. But today's trivia question while we wait is, how many automaker-backed CPOs and charging networks made our top 10 list of new DC fast charging ports opened in Q2 2025? And your options are A2, B3, C4, and D5. And we're gonna provide the answer to this question. I don't know, it's about I think 5 slides in or 6 slides in, something like
Like that.
that. But it's
Right.
it's I think it's pretty fascinating number. Bill, do
So
you
Lauren,
want to? I'm
what
going to stay focused on the screen, but if you can monitor the chat there to see if anybody's getting it right yet.
so while we let folks decide that, let me share with you a quick story. So I'm at an EV charging roundtable, I don't know, 6, 8 weeks ago, and sitting next to the CEO of, I'll call him a mid-sized charging network. And I introduced myself, and he says, "Wait a minute." And he reaches into a stack of papers because he was old school and he had everything printed out. And he pulls out our Q1 report. And he had dog ears and notes all over it. And that was kind of really an aha moment for me. And of course, I offered to answer any questions he might have. But that was a really great kind of icebreaker introduction to see a kind of a printout of our report and the reach that it had. So we're excited to bring this to you.
Yeah, well, while you were doing that, Bill, I actually did go over and look at the comments, and I only see, like, I think 2 correct ones so far. So, at any rate, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. But thanks everyone for your trivia guesses, and because it looked like only a couple of you got it right, I think there's going to be some surprises. So, Bill.
So yeah, let's start out. Quick introductions. I am Bill Ferro. I am the CTO and co-founder of Paren. And actually this week, Loren, marks the 3rd anniversary since I had the original idea for what is now Paren. And I'm really excited, as I said, to share the latest data with you and everyone else on the call. And of course, alongside me is the very first person I met in this industry. So.
Yeah, great. And it turned out that relationship was fortuitous right at the beginning. But at any rate, again, I am Loren McDonald, Chief Analyst at Paren, and Bill and I are sort of partners in crime and diving into the data and trying to, really help our customers make sense of this and make better decisions and benchmark their data and stuff. But I'm like a kid in a candy shop, just playing with all of the data that Bill and his team produce. And today what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some highlights. What we decided we wanted to do is not go through sort of like the entire report, but just pick sort of a few different sort of pages and topics, and then add some additional insights, some additional analysis and stuff outside the report. So this webinar, we want you to think about it is sort of an addendum to the report. But first, we know a lot of people still may not know who Paren is and what we do. So Bill's going to walk us through that. And then I'm going to lead us off on talking about one of my favorite topics was just the expansion of the charging infrastructure. Then we'll go into utilization, reliability, pricing, and then we're going to close out this time with kind of some how we think the industry is going to compete in the future and keys to success. And hopefully that'll leave about 15 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. So Bill, tell everybody who Paren is.
Sure. So I guess we've come a long way in the last 3 years. Today, Parent's data covers what we call the five pillars of EV charging. It's availability, kind of the where and when of charging, reliability, does it work, pricing, amenities, and safety. And if any or all of these data sets are of interest to you, either for your business purposes from an analysis perspective or for real-time API, we now have a real-time what we call Route Companion API. Please reach out to us. You can email us at hello@paren.app or find us on LinkedIn. And we'd be happy to give you a demo and do a deeper dive. So just a quick note about the report. As Loren said, you can get the full report. We're highlighting some pieces of it here. We're really excited to bring this to you. The report really focuses on three of those pillars I just mentioned: availability, reliability, and pricing. All the data we have is sourced through Paren's EV DC fast charging data platform. And the report is focused in the US, although we do have data for our Canadian friends as well. Our data includes data from 52 states. We count DC and Puerto Rico. We also split the data by what we call the top 30 metro regions in the US, from New York at number 1 to Cincinnati at number 30 and everywhere in between. New in this quarter's report, we actually have quarter-over-quarter comparisons, as well as some predictions. And again, we've handpicked some charts for you to highlight here. You can download the full report, and we'll start with the infrastructure section. So Loren, over to you.
Yeah. So, despite a lot of the headwinds that are facing the EV and EV charging industry, many of them coming from Washington, as everyone knows, and there's been really, I think, some misinformation in sort of the media and stuff since like the NEVI pause and stuff that that CPOs and companies in the space were not building new charging station and deploying it. And we're here to tell you that we're on a record pace. Like literally, the industry is building out and deploying stations at an uncanny pace that we've never seen before. And so it's sort of total, right? We're now, since we're well into July, we're over 60,000 ports total. We're approaching 12,000, but you can see the numbers at the end of the quarter. And in the quarter numbers, we went up to over 4,200 new ports opened in Q2 versus a bit over 3,400. And part of that difference in change was Q1 had a bit of a decline versus Q4. And that was really kind of the seasonality of everybody racing to get as many new stations opened in Q4 to hit goals and budgets and to beat the cold winter where I'm out on the West Coast, so we don't know what frozen ground is, but apparently in the East Coast in the winter, you can't trench the ground because it's so frozen and hard. But yeah, so we're back on pace. Increase in new stations, massive, 800 port increase in construction. So really exciting. And we'll talk more. I don't want to steal our thunder, but we'll talk more about sort of the port to station ratio going forward. So, but the takeaway is, despite the NEVI pause, despite the negative, buzz and what we've been hearing and headwinds and stuff with the industry on many fronts, we are deploying, at just an amazing pace. And so it's very positive, very exciting news. And as Bill mentioned, in this report, we decided to do something for the first time, is actually do a forecast. So I'm putting my brand reputation out there. We'll come back in January to see how I did, but I'm basically forecasting that by the end of this year, we will have opened 16,700 new DC fast charging ports in the US. And that's about, I think about 2,500 more than last year. But there's really two interesting things that I want to talk about on this chart in comparing the pink to the purple bars, the last couple. The first is that, as everyone knows, Tesla with its supercharger network has been the 800-pound gorilla and really driving in the dominant deployment of stations and ports over the years. But for the first time ever, last year in 2024, all of the other charging networks combined actually, opened and deployed, about 2,200 or so, 2,300 or so more ports than Tesla did. So that was like a really positive sign that the rest of the industry was starting to invest and build and deploy at significant scale. Now, again, it's like dozens of networks versus one, right? And so we'll show you some interesting data in a minute that shows that sort of scale and difference. But I think the second thing is that what we're seeing is that Tesla seems to be running at about a plus or minus 6,000 ports per year average. We have no idea, obviously, what necessarily what's going to happen, next year, et cetera. But it seems like they're hitting a pace of plus or minus 6,000, which is still far and away larger than anybody else. But I think it's all, Bill, really, really exciting news. So
Actually, and before you jump off on that,
yeah.
though, because we also did some long range forecasting too, right? There's a 2023 NREL study that said we need 182,000 public fast charging ports by 2030. So where are we on that pace?
Yeah, so I did a little analysis around that. So we took sort of the current pace and forecasted pace and added like about 1,000 ports higher each year going out to 2030, and that puts us at roughly about 160,000 ports. So relatively close to that NREL forecast. But there's two things that are important to understand relative to that. When they did that forecast a couple of years ago, the electric vehicle, the VIO, the vehicles in operation, the number of EVs on the road, and those sales forecasts were a bit higher than they are today. Like everybody's been bringing down their forecasts for all the reasons that everybody knows. But at the same time, we're seeing deployment and the number of new companies coming in this space increase. So, Bill, I think we're actually going to be in really good shape. And the worries that we've heard from many in the industry that there might not be enough charging stations and ports to support the number of vehicles on the road. I have no fear of that anymore, and I also just think in general that the market will follow the demand, right? And so if it is underpaced, they will step in and take care of it. So I think it's really exciting news that we're gonna hit what we need to hit. All right, drum roll. The answer to the trivia question is 5 automakers. So if you look at the table on the right, you'll see obviously up at the top Tesla, which basically started out the 2012, 2013, and really kicked off. And then several years ago, Volkswagen, via the Dieselgate settlement, launched Electrify America. And if you doubt whether they're truly an automaker network, if you email people Electrify America, their email is VW, right? So and then of course Rivian, I think it was about 4 years ago, launched both their DC fast charging level 2 networks. And then of course in the last sort of 12, 18 months and stuff, Mercedes and IO joined. And Bill, I don't know about you, but I just think this is just like amazing, right? Because for a decade, all the automakers, not to pick on them, but all the automakers basically didn't want to get into the charging industry, didn't feel they needed to, because they never had to get into the gas station business or whatever. But I think it's clearly what we've seen that they stepped in because they felt the rest of the industry wasn't necessarily delivering the greatest experience, and if they wanted to sell more EVs, they had to step up. And so I think this is, any rate, and Bill, I know you have,
Loren, that number could be even a little bit higher, right? We had a debate on EVgo, right? Because some of their newer sites, most of their newer sites, they're done in partnership with GM Energy and Pilot Flying J.
Yeah.
right? So does
Yeah.
GM get credit for that? Ultimately, we decided no, but it does show that they're involved beyond just their partnership with IANA.
Yeah.
And Ford is engaged in a different way, and that the Ford Charge Network has over, I think, 250 sites,
Yeah.
located mostly at dealerships, at their dealerships, right? But there's a lot of that infrastructure was installed
Yeah.
last year
Yeah.
as part of a now defunct program. So they're engaged. The automakers are truly engaged.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, Bill, if we go below the top 10, there's Ford Charge and stuff like that. And as you mentioned, we probably just in general could have included GM as part of Ego, but you say, as we said, they're clearly a major player, partnerships with several companies and stuff. So, and just sort of close out on that before we go to the chart on the left. Again, you just look at the Tesla. And the number of ports that the supercharger team opened in Q2, just crazy, 6 times the number 2 player of ChargePoint and stuff. And so, but I think the fascinating thing, Bill, is I'm really excited to share this chart like a year from now. And I think we're going to see several of these companies towards the bottom of the list move up towards the top, and you'll see, Walmart and some of the other players on this. And so I think, one of the takeaways, and we're going to talk a lot about this today, is that it's a new ball game. There are these, sort of these major new players that are entering the market and that are changing a lot of the dynamics. And one of those dynamics is just the size of the stations, the number of ports per station. This is one of my favorite metrics. And I did a LinkedIn post about this, I think a week or two ago. I called it, 10 is the new 4, right? For a long time, people were really excited if they went to a charging station that had, like 4 150 kWs or something like that, right? And really these major players in particular are sort of standardizing, if you will, around about 10 ports. Some of them are still doing some 8s and stuff like that, or 9s, but and Tesla's obviously, doing, 16, 20, 24, 40, 50, 100, right? And we're seeing BP Pulse, do some of their airport charging hubs, and the one in Houston that are, Rove with 40, right? So, the one of the other trends that we're going to, really sort of repeat and talk about today is just the uptick in the size of the stations. And Bill, it's like the importance of this is just really creating greater confidence in EV drivers, less congestion. If hardware goes down, you still have, another eight chargers that are working and stuff like that. So
And we'll see that in some of the slides coming up, actually.
yeah, yeah.
That impact.
All right. So yeah.
So there's a debate going on in the comments about ports versus connectors. So I'm using the term connector here specifically, but we really think that it's important. This is an important trend to look at over time, right? We know that many of these newer, larger stations, they're splitting 60-40 or 50-50, a split between CCS and NACS connectors on their stalls. But it's important also to understand what's happening to the existing infrastructure. ChargePoint has their OmniPort capability similar to Tesla's Magic Dock. Other CPOs are swapping connectors in the field to account for what we think is going to be a strong 2026 and beyond for NACS charging. Now, we put this slide together before today's news that we learned that GM is introducing the Bolt this year, I believe, right? With native
I think it's
NACS
early next year, I
early next
think.
year
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
native NACS, right? And so we think this is going to be a very important trend to watch. We think it's a bit early in the game maybe right now, but one thing that does stand out is that it is going slower than we think it is. We would have thought that there would be more NACS connectors on the non-Tesla networks preparing for that future, but it's not quite there yet. We do expect this number to change. We've got it here because we're going to keep monitoring this situation.
Yeah, and I think, Bill, you and I both done this, go out and visit some supercharger stations to sort of see what's going on. And I've been going to one up the street from me, and I live in the Bay Area suburb where it's just dominated by Tesla. So we don't sort of reflect the sort of the broader distribution of EV brands and models here. But each time I've been, there's been at least one non-Tesla charging, and but I've talked to people on the East Coast in like New York and stuff that say they're seeing sometimes 30-40% of the EVs charging at a Tesla supercharger being non-Tesla. And so I think, one of a couple of our sort of warning signs today that we want to say on this is, while we understand why a lot of the CPOs and charging networks are maybe moving cautiously on adding the NACS connectors. Uh, People are moving and switching from your charging network over to Tesla, as we speak. And so I think just, a warning sign that if you wait too long, right, you might lose those customers permanently, because many of them are migrating already over to Tesla because of its sort of brand and known reliability and et cetera. So, but this is going to be definitely something interesting to watch to see if that purple bar moves up a lot more going forward.
And how fastly it moves,
Yeah.
quickly moves, right? So let's switch gears now to utilization, right? So the headline here, there we go, is that there's a decrease in utilization, but let's be really clear. Our data shows that this is not really a result of any significant impact. There are two key factors here. The first is the trend that we see every Q2, right? Warmer weather means shorter charging stops. If you drive an EV, you know that batteries need to warm up to efficiently charge. That leads to longer sessions. So overall, the quarter-over-quarter decline is small, and there are some outliers, but the second factor here really is in the growth of new ports, as we've been talking, right? The growth of new ports has outpaced demand in several key areas. And so we thought it was really important to dive into that to understand. So in what we're calling an exclusive to the webinar audience, we dug deeper. This is not in the report. So for you 170 folks on the call right now, we've got this special for you. So this, the question really is infrastructure build out ahead of demand? So let's look at this table, right? California is our baseline. We see a small change in utilization with decent infrastructure growth factor quarter over quarter, right? California has the most chargers, so it really takes a lot to move the needle. But this tells us that there's really more demand than supply, and more growth is needed in the state. It's obvious if you live in California and try to publicly charge there. But now let's look at the top of this chart, right? We see several states where the port growth has been significant, 35% in Massachusetts, 31% in Texas, right? But the demand is not yet there. This is great news for EV drivers in those states or passing through those states, right? And for those CPOs, you need to have patience and a view of the long haul to get to the expected ROI as growth increases, right? And at the bottom of the chart, we have Wyoming, which is really the only state on the whole list that had a significant growth both in utilization and in port growth and station and port growth. And so, Loren, I don't know if you had any thoughts about what's going on out west there in Montana and Wyoming.
Yeah, I mean, just theories. I don't have sort of data to prove it, Bill. But my theory on this is that it was sort of springtime, right? And so there's more people on going on road trips out to Mount Rushmore and many of the sort of the national parks and stuff out there in sort of the plains and mountain states. But secondly, I think, yeah, it's just there's with the current wave of EV drivers, there's just much greater confidence to drive out on road trips into sort of more rural areas. I mean, I think for a long time, when you talk to average people who maybe don't own EVs, and they've heard that there's no EV chargers out there in those rural areas and stuff, and whether there's enough or not, we know there's still not necessarily enough, but I think people that they're having EVs now that have 300 400 miles of range, they understand how to charge. The charging stations are more reliable. And so I think part of it, again, it's just a theory, is that people are just becoming more comfortable and confident to go on road trips out in these rural areas. But again, we're also in these states. These are really low EV adopting states, so we're talking, kind of small numbers and stuff. But
Yeah.
the other thing, Bill, is we didn't show it here, but we also did the same analysis for the MSAs, and it was even more striking when we looked at the MSAs. There was several, I think it was like about 8 or 10 of the MSAs that had a massive number of high percentage of quarter over quarter port growth, 30-40% number of increase. And part of it was what we've been talking about with these new players putting in these really large stations. So the port growth, if you're adding 10, 12, 20 port stations, right, versus 2 or 4, like that port growth just sort of takes off. But these same companies, many of them we work with, and have told us that they're just on their plans, right? They plan to open thousands of stations by the end of 2030, and so they're not necessarily matching their build out in parallel exactly with demand, right? They're literally just building out ahead of demand and future proofing. And so in the short term, that not necessarily great from an economics perspective for some of the companies, but it's really great for consumers and drivers, right? There's going to be less queuing, less backup, more reliability options, et cetera. So we think it's all, for most people, we think it's all really good news.
Good. Okay. And you talked about reliability, right? As something that is emboldening drivers, right, to take these longer trips, and that's really what our data is showing as well, right? So we took a look at sort of the longer trend of reliability in the infrastructure, and our reliability looks at a bunch of different factors. It really is trying to answer one question: Can I charge? Right? Can I charge here at this particular port within the station? Right. So, after a significant, what I would call a challenge in the summer of 2024, we're really seeing a steady increase in our reliability index. Again, giving credit to, as we've been saying all along, the launch of newer, larger stations, but also to some of those reliability incentives that are, making the industry take a better look at, whether it's from NEVI or from the state programs, right? They're really taking hold, and we're seeing better, more proactive maintenance plans. The hardware that's being deployed is getting better. We know that station refreshes are continuing, whether it's swapping old hardware out on the existing station, or we've seen even some stations switch networks and come on board. All of this looks better, right, for the EV driver, which really then brings more revenue to charging stations owners and operators.
Yeah, and Bill, I would just add that and you were on the forefront of this, and this is really why you got in the industry 3 years ago, is focused on the reliability question. And back then, just majority of the headlines in the media was around a lot of the reports, whether it's anecdotal or studies that talked about 25% of charging hardware was not working, and that type of thing. And I think it was really a black eye in the industry for a while, and a lot of people got the wake up call. And so all the things you talked about, but also just a greater focus on accountability and response times, rolling those trucks in hours instead of days and weeks. Better service level agreements, and contracts with, companies like Charger Help and Field Service Advantage, different companies that are moving quickly to go out there and repair the stations. So I think we're going to continue to see that number go up over the coming quarters.
And then let's go into our third section here. So we'll take a quick look at pricing. And again, our full report has all the breakdowns, but here's just some of the highlights. Right? We know that the busier states are moving more and more towards time of use pricing. It's a way to, in theory, shift some of the load. Right? In general, we saw over 360 stations switch from fixed to TOU. Of that group, 60% of those stations were in California, New York, New Jersey, Florida, right? It makes sense. Those are higher utilization states. Makes sense to work to manage the load with time of use pricing. We also saw 30%, so over 2,000 stations change their price from the previous quarter. And when you average them all together, it averaged out to a 4-cent increase for those that made changes. There were actually some smaller CPOs that lowered their pricing, likely in from what we could see competitive situations. And we've seen some of that in the competitive analysis that we've done with customers as well. We even saw leading up to the 4th of July holiday. Now, while the 4th of July is part of Q3, we saw leading up to it holiday pricing going into effect across a variety of networks. And so, that's to me one of the key things that differentiates the EV driving public from the gas charging. You don't see holiday pricing at the gas pump around the 4th of July.
Yeah, but we also are seeing some like introductory pricing, like
Yeah,
when some of these major new players come into a new market, we're seeing like what, below 40 cents, right?
right, right.
For some of these and stuff. And we're also we touched on this in the pricing webinar last month, but we're also seeing when there's like charging stations that are either co-located, like in the same shopping mall parking lot or retail parking lot or nearby. Like we're starting to see a repeat of the old gas, price wars that we used to see. At least when I was a kid, there was a lot of that. Back when gas was 30 cents a gallon. I'm aging myself there, but at any rate, yeah, we're starting to see sort of more, what could emerge as price wars and stuff. The other thing I would just say on sort of Nebraska is really a sort of interesting standout, and that's part of it because they were one of those states that required a lot of change so that that CPOs could charge by the kilowatt hour instead of by time and stuff. But that's still apparently that's still in transition, so we're still seeing some of that time price base.
It is. And if you go to the next slide, actually Nebraska shows up here too, right? So
Yeah,
when we look at prices at the state level, Hawaii is still the most expensive. I think I mentioned earlier, I was this morning on the news, I was watching the news because there was a tsunami warning in Hawaii. Luckily, it looks like everyone was safe. But I was looking at the backups and I was trying to spot the EVs along the way. And they showed the ubiquitous gas station backup for those who didn't have a full tank when they left their house. So I found that interesting. But if you're in Hawaii and you had to charge today, you probably paid somewhere in north of 90 cents per kilowatt hour. But then Nebraska, when we do these pricing comparisons, we leave out the time of use. So while Nebraska does have a high number of time of use stations, not time of use, sorry, time-based, right?
right.
So if you're charging $5 an hour as opposed to 50 cents a kilowatt hour, right? But when we look at those that are fixed or TOU pricing in our model, the Nebraska has the lowest primarily because their public utility charging stations have pricing in the 23 to 25 cents per kilowatt. Now, we've talked a few times about doing some deeper research on public utility charging. There are pros and cons, and there are people that are wildly opposed to public utilities charging. But maybe we'll have to add Nebraska to that list.
Yeah.
But it's always interesting to look at what's happening at the state level.
Yeah, we've talked about it in the past as well. As Florida continues to be one of the lowest average price states because of
Right.
Florida Power and Light having a number of stations in that market. All right, so we powered through the first three sections. Bill, we're gonna close out with something that we haven't done before, but really sort of talk about what we think are sort of how CPOs are going to compete in the future and keys to success before we go into Q&A. But again, we've talked a lot about this today, and we think that one of the most significant and biggest trends in the public fast charging space is really just all these new players that are entering the market and are really raising not only the customer experience, but raising and increasing the expectations of drivers, right? And for a lot of you who've been who are on the webinar today who've been driving EVs for a while, like the image on the left probably looks familiar, where you're driving somewhere, and there's a one port, two port 150 kW charging station out in the back corner lot, and it might or might not be working. There's probably not lighting or whatever, so you don't actually feel safe, right? And if it's full or not working, like then you got to drive somewhere else, right? Versus obviously the new approach that we've talked about is larger, higher power stations, many of them with lounges or co-located with restaurants, and things like Buc-ee's and things like that. And so it's, uh, what it's leading to is what I like to call sort of fast charging stations are growing up. Right, so we're seeing things like this Rove station down in Santa Ana, right, with 40 stalls and a store with a I think it's Gerson's. I forget the name of the grocery store that they partnered with, right? And you see a car wash there. BP Pulse is starting to launch um, uh, large charging stations, like near they call them like charging hubs near airports. This one's LAX that opened, I think, a week ago. They just opened one in San Francisco. They have a big, I think it's a 24 port hub in Houston and stuff. And a lot of these are targeting uh, high session users, rideshare drivers, et cetera, in urban settings. Obviously, we're seeing the automakers like Mercedes with their charging hubs, and high power chargers and canopies, and in many cases lounges and things like that. Iona, of course, the 8 automaker partnering, doing sort of the same thing, and just really everything, including even squeegees, right, to wash your windshields, like the basic stuff that we're used to, that never existed in most places, are becoming standard. And then of course a week ago or so, Tesla opened its diner down in Southern California. And obviously this was a very expensive undertaking, and we're not going to see hundreds of these. We might, I think Elon said they might open, I think, something like 10 or whatever. So the point of this is that if you're a CPO, a regional player, or a national player, or whatever it is, like, this is what you're going to be competing against in the future, a significantly different customer experience. So Bill, let's close out with kind of wrapping this all together, and what we think sort of some of the keys to success are, and by that nature, how CPOs are going to be competing.
Right, and the first one is all about location, right? We did some competitive analysis for a customer and found multiple instances of where it was all about location. If there's an opening between the highway exit ramp and your nearest competitor, if you can bring that in, um, then and be in between them, then we say take it. Well, we saw several instances where we saw really fast, exceptional ramp up of charging stations when they were closer to the exit ramp, with good to great amenities, and it really had a significant improvement.
Yeah, and I would just say, Bill, that the location is one of the things, the smaller and regional players, it's the one area that they can actually compete with, right? If they have
Right.
a better location, so maybe they don't have the billions of dollars of automakers, et cetera, backing them up, or a Walmart where they can write big checks to build these big stations. But what they may have is a great location. The second area that we've sort of harped on a lot today as well is just customer experience, right? And in many cases that we've said, that's not been where it could or should be. And part of that is just things like ease of use and the growth and use of things like plug and charge, right? These amenities, right? The lounges, the canopies, and just all the, and food service and coffee, my favorite thing. But and safety, right? And so it's going to be critical to really check all of those boxes, because that's what people, drivers are going to be sort of comparing to, is like, does it have all of these things that I'm doing, while my car is parked charging? I want to recharge my, my brain and my body, right?
Right. And then on the power level side, we really see two polar opposites here, right? As you mentioned much earlier in the webinar today, right? We still see a bunch of 50 kilowatt chargers being commissioned, right? And for longer dwell time, or where charging is more of a customer convenience than anything else, then this is probably the right price point for site hosts to pay to put that hardware in place. And then on the flip side, at the higher end, we see one way for any regional or major CPO to compete with superchargers is really to outpower them. We consistently hear, folks that with 800-volt cars that, when they're faced with a choice, like my favorite Buc-ee's, do I turn left to go to the supercharger, or do I turn right to go to the other charging station? If I'm an 800-volt car, I'm going to go to where I can get the best charge, and that's probably to turn to the competition. So the two different opposites. Again, knowing what's around you, knowing what's coming, knowing all the different factors. This is one of the key things that comes into play.
Yeah, and the next area really is something that I think that's sort of relatively new to the industry. I mean, except for Tesla, right? Tesla is sort of has been the sort of the gold standard and brand. Even if you talk to people that don't have an EV, they may be familiar with the red and white Tesla supercharger that they may not fully understand what it is. But and then within the industry for drivers, right? It's like there was that huge brand recognition and awareness and stuff. And so I think, as somebody who spent a major portion of my career in the marketing world, I think we're going to see, believe it or not, marketing start to become an important part in the industry and everything, whether it's advertising, but really, PR and social media and brand building and awareness, signage, building loyalty programs, integrating with your apps, all these different things, and underpinning that is going to be also just things like reliability and the customer experience. So we think, in the future, just like whether it's in the airline industry or a lot of other industries, right, that ultimately people are going to migrate to brands that they have an affinity to and trust. And then again, on the on the sort of marketing customer acquisition side, right? It is becoming hyper competitive now. We're going from, where there was 10, 15 charging networks several years ago. We now track about 75 CPOs and charging networks in the fast charging industry. Now, a lot of those are very small and maybe opening a couple of stations, but nonetheless, just the volume and size and magnitude and war chest that some of these companies have, um, is significant. So, how are you going to differentiate? How are you going to acquire customers? And so, again, we've seen in the past companies like Electrify America, EVgo, ChargePoint, one of their advantages was doing those automaker partnerships, right? Whether it's free charging, et cetera. And so, if you're not one of those companies, how are you going to acquire customers? You're going to have to attract people through marketing, through partnerships. Maybe it's with like apartment complexes that are across the street from your charging station. Make sure you're integrated in apps, signage, like just sort of basic stuff, so that you can ensure that you're capturing your share of the market.
And then lastly here, we know that EV drivers are getting more and more choices, right? And that's why one of the reasons why we see a bright future for what I call the power of competitive pricing data analysis. And we're actually focusing on ways to bring this to both businesses and consumers as a way. It's not urgent yet, because we know, as from talking to EV drivers, we know that price isn't necessarily their first priority right now. But, and Loren, I talk about this all the time. I'm convinced that pricing is going to be a major factor
Yeah.
in driving growth as the infrastructure build out continues. So again, I think it's knowing what your customers are doing, knowing when they're doing it, and then responding appropriately.
We're working with a lot of the largest companies in the space, really excited about helping them leverage our data for using sites and benchmarking against competition and changing pricing strategies, et cetera. So if you'd love to learn more about our data and how our other customers are working with us, scan that QR code. It'll take you to a calendar and we'll do a demo for you.